Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, the Council on Undergraduate Research, and again, the National Science Foundation EPSCoR Education Outreach and Diversity Council, as we present virtual undergraduate research in action, highlights, and how-tos. We hope today's session will support you as you create virtual undergraduate research opportunities on your campus, or as we are all experiencing now via your home office. Let me welcome today's presenters. Kimberly Harris, she is the chair of CUR's Education Division and a board member at the Council on Undergraduate Research, an associate professor in the College of Education at Georgia Southern University, at the School of Geosciences at the University of South Florida, Matt Patley, assistant professor in the Computer, Electrical, and Software Engineering Department at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Jennifer Grew is the professor of professional practice, she's an assistant professor of professional practice in the Department of Psychology at Utah State University. And Krista Levin, a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Utah State University. I thank them immensely for taking some time today. We know that all of us are spending immense time Zooming and webinaring, so we appreciate them sharing all of their experience with us today. And a special thanks to my co-host, Yolanda Williams-Bay, and a few words of welcome for her before we get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Lindsay just stated, my name is Dr. Yolanda Williams-Bay, and I am a representative from the established program to stimulate competitive research, or as everyone has already called it, the EPSCoR program, specifically representing our Education Outreach and Diversity Council. One of our biggest initiatives amongst our council is to make sure that we effectively engage students at all levels of undergraduate and graduate research. So we're hoping that this conversation today kind of helps prepare us to continue our missions and support our undergraduate students via virtually now in the midst of the current week of what's happening. I'll turn it back over to Lindsay so we can proceed.
All right, and with that, our first presenter is going to be Dr. Harris.
Thanks, Lindsay, and I really like what Dr. Williams-Bay said about this being a conversation. You know, in a perfect world, we would be actually talking about this in a way that, you know, we would have obviously conversation how it's going for everyone. But I hope that this particular webinar is helpful in a lot of different ways. I was asked specifically to talk about the pedagogy of how we go about doing undergraduate research. I am a program director of a completely online program, and I've also had online undergraduate students with me, usually during the summer, but certainly, you know, now whatever semester might come forward. So that's kind of my background. I'm certainly not the end-all be-all of undergraduate research or how to teach it online, but I hope that I'm able to provide you with some kind of guidance about creating a culture and a climate in the online environment so that the student, whether you have a whole bunch in your lab or if you have one or two that you're specifically working with, how to kind of create that mentoring experience for them that'll be helpful for both you and the kids. So, I think we know this about our world anyway, but it's really important that you have to have that kind of community. And I talk about climate and I talk about culture, but it's really about having a sense within the students who you work with that it's a common goal that you're working towards and that you're available and you want them to be available. And so that sense of community is kind of really important. For those of y'all who may be familiar with what we used to do, critical friends groups, where we put everybody in undergrads in groups and had them really give each other directed peer feedback. That's the same kind of community that you're trying to create in an online environment. And there's certainly ways to do that. And so I don't want us to think about online research with undergrads as being very sterile. It certainly needs to be, you know, just as interactive and personal as it was when you had them sitting in your office, or when you were mentoring them in whatever capacity that you had. So that creating community is the very first thing that we have to think about when we approach any kind of online learning, but certainly online with students. What we do in teaching, and I realize that a lot of us went to teacher school, and so I don't want to wax prolific too much about that, is that we have to provide a rationale for why we're doing this online, regardless of the fact that there's COVID. And we have to provide them a rationale for why undergraduate research is important to them. And it has to be something that appeals to the undergrad student. It has to be something that is happening right now. And it has to be something, that's believable. To tell a student to engage in this particular work online because it's going to get them into a better graduate school, or any of the other reasons and the benefits that we know about undergraduate, may not ring authentic for them right now. So let's try and think about the reason why they need to participate in this online. And there's lots of different reasons I'm sure that most of y'all can come up with. But when we're teaching anything, that anticipation is what we call induction, is what gets them interested and what gets them motivated. And so that same type of pedagogy that we display in the classroom, by showing ourselves as being excited about it and by showing how motivated we are to help them with the research, can certainly be transferred or transmitted through online. And there's a variety of ways that you can do that, through open discussion boards, through videos, through audios, doing synchronous work. So there's plenty of ways that you can do that. It's not just a way of, saying, here's the rationale for why we're doing this undergraduate research. They should be able to believe in the rationale that you're providing to them. For those of y'all who are familiar with the community of inquiry, and this is some kind of old school stuff, but it really is the basis for how we teach online. And so the big three in there are social, cognitive, and teaching presence. And that community of inquiry is how we build teaching and teachable moments within an online environment. And so it's not just the ability of the students, and it's not just the ability of the instructor or the professor. It's certainly a combination of these things. And so is it a lot of work? Of course it is. And it takes a lot of front loading on the part of the instructor. And it takes, certainly a whole lot of interaction with the students to make sure that they're understanding what the goal of the research is. But these three foundational pieces of online learning are how we kind of create and construct what it means to be involved in undergraduate research. And so, whereas, we also do these with just regular old courses, when we talk about a community of inquiry, that's the whole basis for how to design undergraduate research instructionally so that the kids are motivated to want to do it, especially in a place where it may not look like they initially had started. And so, and I'm going to give you some links at the end of this, so if this is of any interest to you. It certainly is both seminal and state-of-the-art, so there's lots of research that supports the community of inquiry, even so much as when it addresses independent projects by undergraduate students, as well as group projects by undergraduate students. So I hope that information, if you would like to follow up on it, I hope that information is also helpful to you. The social presence that we talk about certainly can be administered or created by doing all those kind of things, video and audio. I'm also providing you a couple of different ideas for you to do video and audio, but the cognitive presence is the front loading. So that's the part that makes you have to do all the stuff. And so the cognitive presence shows the students that you've got a pretty good idea of what it is that you're headed toward in this particular research, and provides a significant amount of content so that they're able to work their way through both independently and with your guidance. And so this last one, teaching presence, that's you. That's where you model and you check for understanding, and you do all of the things that you would typically do were you in their presence, but now you just do them online. And so these can be realized through a variety of different, depending on what your LMS is, can be realized by a variety of different experiences that you have in there. But of course, the big thing insofar as community of inquiry for us that's different than all the rest of that is that mentoring piece. And so mentoring is different from a teaching presence because it means specifically that, you know, you've got expectations and the kid has expectations. So that's kind of an overview of what we look at in these particular types of online undergraduate experiences. So Robin, if you'll go to the next one, I'll kind of show you there it is in a very nice Venn diagram. And so it's got all the cute pieces in there. And that again is from that community of inquiry. There's your online presence. And so this is how I broke up my particular summer schedule for my students that are doing it online, and it requires a lot of check-in, but I have those particular tasks for them. And so this is just at the end of the 6 weeks. And then of course they have an additional 4 weeks where they actually complete the work that they're doing. And so then on this next slide, you'll see that's what it looks like. So there's my methodology. Obviously, the introduction to the research is where we have the research question. All of this is done online. All of this is done in modules, and it follows a very specific interaction. So then that's I mean, typical of any research that any of us would do, but that's the same kind of research that was outlined in the 6 weeks plan that you see before that. So then here are some resources that I did for you. There's the instructor presence and online class. Again, that's an oldie but goodie from 2012. If you're interested in more stuff on the community of inquiry, that's also the baseline on the other one. And then many of us are familiar with the reform faculty. So there's some protocols and activities that are specific to arranging that. And then on the last slide, I've included, and I'm sure that y'all are all doing these, and I didn't want to, most of us have way more resources that we need, but I have provided specific links to all of these different types of recordings and ways that you can actually incorporate a real strong online pedagogy using a lot of video and face-to-face games and things like that.
So I presume we just keep going here. I didn't know if we were going to have breaks of any kind, but this is Jeff Ryan, University of South Florida. I'm going to talk to you about some strategies that we do, that I've done in terms of virtualized undergraduate research activities. These are course-based activities that I've been involved with over the last number of years. Please, next slide. Hello, here we go. Okay. Oh, there it is. And so I'm a geoscientist. Full disclosure, I'm a geoscientist who works on marine and planetary problems, and so you'll see a little bias in what I present. But geoscientists are field researchers. This is what we do. So getting outside and actually looking at materials, looking at samples, looking at geological features. How do you move from that to the situation where we're in now, where people are virtually connected? Where you don't get necessarily to do those kinds of things. Well, as it turns out, there are options. There is what I sort of lump generally as STEM informatics. There have been growing bodies of data resources in all aspects of study of the Earth and even other planets. These were generated primarily for the benefit of researchers, but they're accessible to all. They are publicly available resources. They're geospatial information systems of various sorts, some for the Earth, some for other planets. They include a variety, in fact, a growing menu of data visualization tools, and they link seamlessly to other databases that are georeferenced or time referenced. So one can actually compare geology to demography to agriculture to other kinds of things. Another option, which I'll talk less about now, is the idea of actually using real research instrumentation. There are a lot of different kind of research instrumentation that are fully operable online now, which means you can use them in your class and your students can use them as well. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what I've done in my classes. These are research activities, course-based research activities. I'm going to basically focus on the low-hanging fruit here. I've done talks about this in terms of low-cost, no-cost activities because, in fact, there's really very little cost to doing any of this. So open-ended planetary image analysis is something I've done routinely in introductory courses where we're actually working with databases from other planets. And in majors courses, as well as intro courses, I've done similar kinds of activity using terrestrially focused research databases as well. And I have done work with the remote use of research instrumentation in majors courses. Well, I've got some slides that I provided to Kurt, which hopefully they'll distribute about that if anyone's actually interested in it. What all of these have in common is that they involve the collection and, more importantly, the interpretation of real Earth data or real planetary data. The students can draw their own conclusions, they can become experts, and they can actually make real discoveries. Next slide. And one of the key tools for doing this is probably already on your desktop and already on your student's desktop, and that's Google Earth. Google Earth is a GIS, it's a geospatial information system. Google designed it for its own purposes, but they have gathered in so many different kinds of information that it's a remarkably powerful tool. One of the bodies of information they brought in was actually made by agreement with NASA. NASA was looking to disseminate its discoveries about other planets, all of the various missions that have gone to the moon, to Mercury, to Mars, to the moons of Jupiter. They're looking for places to get this out and make it publicly available per the mission requirements of NASA. And Google Earth and NASA struck an agreement whereby they have created virtual globes for the presentation and study of a number of these different global databases for Mars and the moon in particular. So all of these are readily accessible. If you've gone into Google Earth, look in the planets option and you get to choose the moon or Mars, and all sorts of things will come up. There are global maps of some of these different databases. And the thing to understand about this, next slide, please, is that these images that Google Earth gives you are not just image drapes. They're actually linked directly into the actual databases maintained by NASA and NASA research laboratories. And so the imagery for the surface of Mars that comes up on Google Earth is actually directly drawn from the Malin Space Science Systems imagery from the Mars orbital camera on the Mars Global Surveyor. The infrared data that they present as global drapes, global maps, is actually coming from the Mars Odyssey mission from the Themis thematic mapper database, and you can go drill directly into it. You can actually look at the new high resolution imagery from Mars that's collected by the HiRISE probe on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. All of this is accessible straight through Google Earth. You can look at any of these images, you can play with these images. But more importantly, there are other tools that you can use as well. One that was created at Arizona State University that's particularly valuable in this regard is something called JMARS, which is a Java-based tool that allows you to take these different imagery systems and actually overlay one on the other, compare and contrast, and actually make some real discoveries with them, okay? So next slide, I'll show you some of the kinds of imagery that you can play with in JMARS. For Mars, we have a global data set for Mars elevation collected by something called the Mars Orbital Laser Altimeter, or MOLA. It's actually a better database for the elevations on the surface of Mars than we have for the surface of the Earth. It can be done in color-coded, and so this particular image shows you a color-coded map of Mars elevation. The lighter colors tend to be high, the darker colors tend to be low. Next slide, please. There are also databases available through Google Earth and JMARS to look at this unusual infrared imagery that's been collected on Mars. The infrared imagery provides a lot of different kinds of information. What I'm showing here is something called daytime infrared imagery. It was collected by the thematic mapper on the Mars Odyssey probe, THEMIS. It shows best things related to relief, steepness of slopes, essentially, because you get different responses off of flat and horizontal surfaces than you do off of sort of deeply angled surfaces. And so you can actually spot the slopes and the walls of craters. You can see differences in elevation, ejecta blankets, things of that nature pretty readily in THEMIS, daytime infrared imagery. And this can be contrasted with another kind of infrared imagery. Next slide, please. Which is nighttime infrared imagery. Okay, just to give you a little bit of an explanation of this infrared imagery, this is actually heat emitting from the surface of Mars. When it's daytime, the sun is heating it and there's heat coming off of Mars. That's what the daytime imagery is. The nighttime imagery is actually collected at dusk. As the sun shuts off, there is heat emitted from the surface of the planet, and that heat is emitted more rapidly from finer grained things. And so you can see rougher surfaces versus smoother surfaces. And most importantly, you can see the pile up or build up of sediment and fine grained material related to processes on Mars in the nighttime imagery. And so, next slide. Using JMARS, one can actually take all of these different kinds of databases and combine them. And what I have here is actually a picture drawn from all three of those databases, including elevation, which is where the color comes from, the daytime infrared, which is what is sort of emphasizing the slopes here on the surfaces, and the nighttime infrared, which shows you the fine grained materials. And with this information and a little bit of essentially application of geological common sense that students, even in an introductory course, can pick up readily on, please go to the next slide. You can start to do actual geological analysis of the Martian surface. And so students can find river channels on the surface of Mars. They can identify very rapidly the old big craters that date to the early impact history of the surface. They can identify the small young craters that have little rebound peaks in them associated with recent crater bombardment associated from the asteroid belt. And they can see these odd oblate shaped white zones, which are actually dust accumulations that show them the direction of the wind on Mars, okay? And so, next slide. They can do this with NASA imagery, but you don't have to do that just with NASA imagery. You can get closer to home. Google Earth all by itself gives you access to useful information. The picture here of the state of Florida is actually something students did related to identifying flood control features in Southeast Florida, something I had them do in an intro class. Interestingly enough, the flood control features are to prevent floods from the land crossing Miami, not from the rising seas, which one might normally think about. And that has to do with the weather here in Florida. Also, there is a GIS tool very similar to JMARS available for the ocean floor, something called GeoMap app, that allows you to look at the ocean floor in terms of real topography and then combine that with data from a variety of NASA geoscience cyber infrastructure facilities, geochemical data on rock samples and sediment samples from AIDA and NAVDAT, seismic data from IRIS, UNAVCO data for geodesy, essentially land elevation, etc. And the picture I've got here is essentially a picture of an overlay here of the Isobonian subduction system with green, yellow, and red, or shallow, intermediate, and deep earthquake foci overlain with the location of volcanoes in this arc. This is information students can put together and actually start to tell themselves stories about how the Earth is put together and how it works dynamically. And so these tools are there, they're free, and you can play with them. So any questions you have, I'll happily take when the time comes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. My name is Matt Pavlina. I am a professor of computer electrical software engineering at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. I did this research with my colleague here and an undergraduate research student. Next slide. I assumed that you probably didn't want to hear about all the engineering and technical details that we had to go through, but rather how we were able to do kind of this research. We did it virtually, essentially, over the summer, last summer. And so the project was using computer vision for lots of technical things that it doesn't really matter, but it was an undergraduate research sponsored project. And the key things that we were trying to work through related to not the engineering side, but rather the virtual side, is that the three of us as researchers, we're never going to be in the same place at the same time, actually. At one point, one of us was in Germany, the other one was in Russia, and the student was actually in Iceland on a summer study abroad program. And so having us all be in different places really made it much more difficult kind of, to coordinate even when we would chat because of time zone issues and stuff like that. So before we even started, we had to make sure that we had a really good idea of, okay, well, what is it that we want to accomplish? Kind of what is our minimum and maximum level of, what we would consider to be acceptable research output, which is always much less than what you think, especially with an undergraduate student. But it just helped us manage our expectations. We obviously had to come up with a timeline based on that, and our undergraduate research grant application helped ensure that the student had a understanding of that, because we tasked the student with that. And the other thing that we had to do is we had to make sure that we weren't using any really unique or technology that would only be available if we were face-to-face at the university. So like some of the simulation tools or software tools that we have, we only have licenses here at the university. And so we had to make sure that we were able to use just the generally available technology, because we weren't all going to be on campus, especially the student wasn't going to be on campus for most of the summer time. Next slide. Yeah. So at the beginning, when we were establishing the timeline, right, the main focus was trying to just teach the student how to make a timeline and then understand the feasibility. The student had a really, lots of really great ideas and wanted to go far above and beyond what we could have ever even imagined. But having not done research before, was clearly like vastly overstepping what was reasonable given the kind of 3-month timeline that we had. So basically we forced the student to make the initial timeline, and this also gave us a good indication, because we had never worked with the particular student before, kind of, well, what is their organization skills and what are they expecting to get? And then obviously after that, we just slashed and hacked it and brought it down to something that was actually reasonable. But the act of just making them do it was really insightful, because they thought, oh, this thing would take a week. And I was like, no, that definitely won't be taking a week. And, oh, this will, just take us 3 weeks. And it's like, no, definitely you won't be doing that, right? And that's really what you're hopefully trying to teach an undergraduate student, is that, that how to manage their expectations, given the fact that you've done research before and you know that these things take longer than what you expect. So we had to establish also just a general communication guidelines, which, in hindsight, we would have changed it, which is a further slide, but an email update at least every other week with the new information and new kind of discoveries based on the tasks that were given. So that even though we weren't in the same time zone, I could still, look over what they have done and give them information back. But we made it so that if there was a smaller, simpler question, we used a group chat inside of an app called WhatsApp. And the reason we used WhatsApp was because it works over Wi-Fi. So it worked while I was in Germany, it worked while the other researcher was in Russia. It doesn't use cell phone text messaging, so it was able to be able to do that internationally and be able to quickly answer some simple questions or easier questions like that. Next. So in an effort to make sure that we get to the, the community portion at the end, as well as the question and answer, which I think is a lot more valuable, I've really cut this presentation down. So there's actually just one more slide after this. But so what we thought worked this time, and this is kind of the information that I thought would be useful to convey to you, is not the awesome engineering outcome that we got, but the things that worked for us that hopefully can work for you, is that the entire project, obviously, we ensured that we were using software that was available. And so, I mean, this is basically the same thing that Jeff was just saying, right? If this stuff is available, it's free, you can use it for free. That's what you need to be looking for when you're doing this kind of online or virtual type of research, right? If we would have needed lots of extra materials, right? If we had to build something, I mean, engineers are always building something, right? If we had to build something or do a lot of those types of activities, right, it would not have been feasible, but just because we can't ship them to Iceland or Russia so that the person could work on them. Having a way to quickly chat about the smaller questions was, I think, crucial, because it kept the flow going. So it wasn't like, oh, you can only email us once a week, or twice a week or whatever. But it made for those smaller questions of, well, I tried this and it didn't do exactly what I thought. What do you think I should change, right? It made it so that it was a little bit quicker exchange to keep the student motivated and moving along in their project. The other thing that I know is like, how do you do this? Well, I don't know, but the student we have was particularly well suited to working by themselves. They were self-motivated. They were as organized as I would expect from an undergraduate researcher who has never done undergraduate research before. But, you know, I can tell you all sorts of strategies that work really, really well. But if you have somebody that would rather play video games than actually do research, nothing you're going to be able to do, I don't think, is going to actually give them that motivation. So, I think I wish I would have heard Kimberly's presentation, right, about that community, because I think that's really maybe the only thing, is if you establish some sort of community with the student, then you can actually maybe pull them out and make sure that they're staying engaged with the research and actively doing it. Next slide. So if I were to do this again, this is my thoughts for next time, maybe this summer, I would have some additional meetings that were just about the logistics, especially early on in the project, to make sure that the student understood where they're at, where they're going, and if they should adjust their expectations along the way and kind of have a course correction while doing the research, right? Like, oh wow, that took a lot longer than I thought. Okay, then that means this thing's going to take longer. Okay, that means this is going to take longer. Okay, maybe I need to make sure that I adjust my expectations so I'm not feeling demotivated because it seems overwhelming, or I just have too high of expectations. I know you already read these because I talked for a long time, but undergraduate students, they don't know as much as they think they do, right? So they come in, they take for engineers anyway, they take calculus and physics and they ace it and they're like, oh, I know everything, right? No, especially not with research. So the thing that I would do differently is make sure that I would be very intentional about what I'm trying to teach them, what I'm trying to convey to them. Yes, of course, I want research that's useful and will, bring technology to a new level, but I also am trying to teach them skills, organization skills, communication skills, how to write or type up a research presentation, all of these types of things. I asked my student, actually, I said, in your opinion, what could we have done to do differently next time, or should we do differently next time? And direct quote, she just said, more structure is always useful. So I said, along the same lines, a more clearly defined schedule of when we would talk and not just email would have been really helpful. And she said, like, yes, that would have been really helpful, because we did have some video chats through WhatsApp, which was awesome because you could do video chats, even, you know, between Germany and Iceland, or Russia and Arizona, where we are. And so that was really helpful. Of course, now that everybody's gone online, you know, there's everything, Zoom and Google Teams or Microsoft Teams or whatever, I don't know. So, but a clearly defined schedule of when we would talk would probably be really useful. And so some things that I wish I knew before I started was you will definitely get a lot less done than you would if they were face-to-face. I put obviously because, I don't know, maybe that's obvious, maybe it's not, but it's definitely something that even I was shocked at the different in the change of pace and how that affects it. It's much harder to do this online and virtual type of research, but it's just as rewarding. Both it was both rewarding for myself, the student, and, you know, the research outcome that we actually got out of it. She was able to present that, or she was going to present that at EPSCoR. I think she still did. It was just virtual. And then be much clearer than you think you need to be about communication, when you're going to talk, how often, what avenues you're going to use, which avenues are the best suited to reach you at different times, maybe of the day or night, or I don't know, whatever. I think those would definitely have made a big difference in the research project that I did. And with that said, I just want to say thanks so much for your time. And definitely you can do it too. It might be hard, but, you know, you can do it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jen Gruey, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Chrissa Levin. We are co-directors of the Factotum Lab, which is a distance-run, undergraduate-only student research lab. We're in our third year of running our distance lab with undergraduate students, and we're based at a large research university. We currently have 6 active studies that the undergraduate students in our lab are leading from their homes. We're going to share with you a framework on building out a successful distance lab. Next slide. Goals and values of a lab are likely no different in an online environment, and the important part is to notice this and get to the essence of what it is you care about in having a research lab with students, and ensuring that these elements shine through regardless of the environment in which you are working. However, the reason why it's important to notice goals when working with a distance lab is because what often happens in a research lab is that the focus becomes about the outcomes, not about what you want the students to learn or experience, but about what you want them to have completed. And in an online labs, you may have different access to completion. You may not be able to complete the same projects. So it can become really important to dig in one level deeper and say, what is it that was important about completion of the research project instead of the completion itself? And that becomes the basic touchstone. Next slide, please. For example, in our undergraduate research lab, which we have named the Factotum Lab, which means do everything in Latin, we focus on doing. That's the core value of our lab, is simply working hard, thinking hard. We believe that simply working hard, reading a lot of research, and thinking a lot about research holds important value towards career exploration and developing critical thinking skills. We also hold inclusivity high in our values, and we allow all students who meet our prereq criteria and who are willing to sign our hefty contract into the lab. The contract is one of willingness to work hard for either one semester or a minimum of 1 year, depending on their level of commitment, and a variety of responsiveness and reliability commitments. We believe that this is key to working a distance lab, especially one that lets everyone in. Next slide, please. Chrissa. Moving online in a few days or weeks is, of course, riddled with challenges. However, given time to be more intentional it is good to consider what ways the online research experiences are different than the face-to-face and play to the strengths of the online environment. One major question to ask in developing a distance lab is, what can you do or offer in a distance lab that an in-person lab cannot do? Because if we simply took the most productive lab in my department and plopped it online and tried to just find tools to do whatever they were doing to make it the same, it would simply be a less good lab. But that's not how it has to be. There are some things that are done in person that cannot be done online. There are some things that are done online that cannot be done in person. When moving online, attend to things that distance is great for, that online learning and online research is great for, and focus efforts there instead of simply trying to replicate what could honestly be done better in person. It's like how web-based therapy literature learned quickly that if you try to make an artificially intelligent counselor, it was really bad. But if you tried to instead gamify a self-help website that taught psychoeducation, it had really great outcomes. Because a counselor is great at being a counselor, but a computer is great at gamification and teaching in a scalable way. In our lab, one study we're currently working on, for example, is testing potential gender bias in student evaluations. We were noticing the confounds in extant literature and how we couldn't find any studies that controlled for all of the many potential confounds of teaching over a semester. All of the gender bias evaluation studies seemed to be based on an entire semester's worth of teaching and had other notable confounds between conditions. So looking at what we have in our medium that we can do better than what was done so far, we have the ability to tightly control teaching modules that could be compared to full semesters. An online teaching module is exactly the same when played the first time and the 20th time, and an online teaching module that can be controlled to have the exact wording and length, the same visuals, and even attempt same animated narration and voiceover in lecture between an audio lecture over a visual heavy presentation. This type of control would not be possible in person, but is fully possible in our medium. Let's see, Krissa, go ahead. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run through these next ones. My co-panelists might be having some technical difficulties. Another example in our lab is how we work with one semester RAs on their literature reviews, including their goals and values of information literacy, scientific writing, and critical thinking. We work with a project management system called ClickUp, in which we have added modeling examples and tutorials on scientific writing, searching scientific databases, even outlining and structure, and we built it all into one template project. So now anytime a new research assistant joins the lab, we simply add the protocol to their name, and it's as though they have a whole new class added to their agenda, full with due dates and answers about to about 90% of their questions. We still provide individualized mentoring and feedback. However, all of these things that used to need to be taught to every student or fixed in most drafts are now automated. This provides individual students with better training and more confidence, and it saves drastic amounts of time for both us and them. And this simply couldn't be done without a computerized automated system. It's playing to the online medium. Okay, next slide, please.
The final ways we play to the medium is in terms of inclusion and equity, a final lab value. Degree-seeking distance students tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than the traditional students, often working while attending school. They have higher rates of disability, higher rates of veteran status, and higher rates of having families while in school. In our lab, which is currently 13 students, we have a total of 7 mothers and 1 soon-to-be mother, most of whom are stay-at-home mothers. This is playing to the medium. These parents have not had the opportunities to be in other labs, and it brings up questions worth asking that need to touch back to the values and goals. Are children allowed to sit in parents' laps during lab meetings, for example? We certainly have found that this is consistent with our own goals and values as a lab, as it allows for far more flexibility on our lab members' schedules, and that they're notably capable of the same multitasking that our faculty members' parents are capable of when we give them the same chances. And yet these students have not often been given such chances. We found that the same issues with disability are true, as I myself, the co-director of this lab, do have a mobility disability that doesn't allow me to work from a traditional work environment on campus. And at times, I have to turn off my webcam so that I might lay down during a lab meeting. We've had students at times need to turn off their cameras due to being at work, to changing diapers, or to various other needs that are realistically unlikely or impossible to come up in traditional lab meetings. This has likely been true for many of you who are just new to online teaching in this strange new pandemic world. But none of these things are feasible or reasonable in in-person meetings. And this can be an opportunity to play to the medium, to do things and to allow people who otherwise would not have a chance to engage in research or really to just do any research. And this will continue to be true long after things have returned to normal from COVID, from the stay-at-home parents and children to the disabled students who can't attend regular lab meetings, or for those of lower SES who cannot afford to not prioritize work, but might be able to sit in their car in the parking lot and engage in lab meetings, all of whom can succeed if given the chance. This is something that the distance medium allows that the in-person medium does not if we play to the medium. Next slide. So again, developing a successful distance research lab is all about figuring out what it is that we can do better online than in person, and letting go of all of the things that we simply can't do as well. We will never replace in-person labs, but that doesn't mean that we have to be subpar to them. Instead, we can use the values and goals as a touchstone, notice the challenges and overcome them, and simply play to the medium instead of trying to do what the in-person labs were doing already. We can develop these labs to be totally different types of labs because both types of labs do what they do very well, and both focus on purposeful goals and values. Once we get used to the obstacles of distance research and learning and the bright spots of this medium, I posit that the obstacles of in-person teaching may become just as apparent as the online obstacles are now. Thank you, that's all we have.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers that presented today. There are a number of questions that have come through on the questions panel, but there is still time. If you do have a question that you would like to ask of one of our presenters, please use that questions panel. It should be in the bottom right of your GoToWebinar meeting. Just a reminder, we are going to be, we have recorded this and we're going to be sharing that link with you via email. It'll also be available on the webinar archive on the CUR website. And so the first question that we have is for Matt. It's related to your expected timeline, and did the faculty come up with their own timeline that was expected before the student made their initial timeline, and how did you handle that?
So yeah, the faculty, we had talked about generically very much, you know, what the project would look like, kind of what we thought was a reasonable outcome. I don't know that we had like a detailed timeline of what's going to happen for each week, but we did give the student an example timeline for the first few weeks as a kind of like a starter, I don't know, whatever for them, to be able to have something kind of to go off of, because again, they had never done anything like that before. But we did have our own kind of idea of what it would look like and what would happen at what times. but like I said, I don't know that we actually wrote it down in detail. But we did go into our first meeting talking about it with what we thought would be a reasonable expectation for an undergraduate student in this particular project.
Thanks. The next question is for Jennifer. It's a similar one. With regards to your willingness contract, was it the student that made that alone, or the faculty, or was that a collaborative effort?
So what we do with the contracts, and I have my co-presenter on here if she ever she wants to jump in, that's great too. But what we do is we have 3 different contracts that we created that have different expectations, but the students self-select themselves in terms of the level of commitment that they want to do in the lab. And so we kind of have we have 3 different contracts. One's kind of a high commitment, and then medium, and then pretty low commitment. But we found that it works out really well to have it all in writing, in terms of our expectations and what we expect of the students and what the students should expect of us as well. But having it writing there, it helps to kind of clear up any confusion, and we can, and then the other part of it that works really well is having the students self-select themselves. So they read through the different contracts and they decide for themselves, what do I want to do in this lab? Do I just want to kind of dabble here and there and join in the different lab meetings and talk about the research, or do I want to eventually be a lead on a particular research project? And so those 2 elements have made it tends to work out really well. So we're not overly expecting something that a student doesn't really want to give in the lab. So,
right. And one
thank you.
additional thing that I think that we add that's important there is we kind of specify what they can expect from us in terms of meeting their goals. That's part of what we specify. So if they are expecting a letter of recommendation, for example, we say we don't tend to give letter of recommendation for people that dabble, but we do tend to give letter of recommendation for people who are in the 2nd and 3rd level of commitment.
Thank you. This next question is back to Matt. It's brought up, but it actually could go to any of the presenters as well who might want to jump in. That there's been a common theme that's coming up more and more is that there needs to be some research mentor training. And so does Embry-Riddle have particular resources that they give to mentors, and how are they distributing that? And that's also a question for the other presenters as well.
So we as Embry-Riddle, when you do undergraduate research, you do have to do some training, but I guess we didn't really do any how to do kind of virtual online type of research. So we have some resources. We have an undergraduate research institute as well that I'll, answers any and all of my questions. But this kind of doing it online virtually was a first experience for me that I wish I would have maybe known a little bit more prior, but I do get that idea for mentor training.
I will add that we do have our member resource library, and we are adding different resources to that, daily and weekly. And so as we come up, if we find any others that they're there, then certainly that would be a great place to look. I think there are a couple that might be helpful. And there's also a how-to publication that we have, How to Mentor Undergraduate Researchers, that is a pretty slim volume that can be digested pretty easily. And so I would recommend that as well. The next question is for either Jen or Krissa. It is, in particular, do you have any specific ideas that might be good for reimagining those lab bench projects in biology and chemistry and transitioning them to online projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I personally am just real dumb when it comes to hard sciences. So it's hard to imagine things that I don't know about. But I think that brings, this interesting idea about frameworks of obstacles. And I think what it comes down to, where I would suggest building that into the framework, is thinking about the values and goals of the lab and then building in the tools, right? So if you think about what is it that you want your students to learn, you're taking it one step deeper away from the outcomes and towards the learning goals, and then start doing the research of what is it that what are the tools to get you there. So I think that's the biggest step. And I don't personally know any of the tools because I can barely do math, but the idea of thinking about what are those tools that can get you towards the type of thinking that you want those students to do, because then it becomes a tools question instead of it's just about the obstacles at that point. And there are tools, like if anytime the problem is one of software or hardware, things like that, then the solution is also one of software or hardware. And you don't have to be an expert in those things, because somebody else always will be. And sometimes it can be that if your values and goals within the lab allow it, you can get a student to help you with those things. But if not, then of course there's someone on campus that can help you with those things.
Thanks. And there was a particular software or course management program that you were talking about on the Play to the Medium slide. Could you remind us the name of what that was?
Yeah, it's called ClickUp, and it works really well. I found that a lot of times we end up kind of doing themes in terms of what we teach students. So we may, go over and over and over again with a different student, like this is how you put together a literature review. So by building those in that ClickUp software, it saves you a lot of time in terms of mentoring students.
Right, and then you can focus really on the themes that Dr. Harris was talking about for what you spend your time with the student on, of building community and kind of presence, and save things like teaching writing style for the automated systems. But it's ClickUp is the one we like, but you can do it in many systems.
Thanks. So there have been a couple questions about being able to provide payment to undergraduate students. And so I'm wondering if anyone has information or something they're willing to share on how they're documenting the hours that are putting in virtually, and if you're able to still offer any sort of a stipend or payment for your students when they're participating virtually. Maybe we'll take the silence as it might not be something that has been explored, and it would be a topic that would be great. We can revisit that in the Kerr community. And I think that that would be a great place to hear from others that would be able to share their experiences and how they're doing that. And there are a few more questions, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I will make sure to share the remaining questions that came through with our presenters today. And we then also, again, look to the Kerr community. That's another great place to post these questions and start a dialogue up. We're also doing Kerr conversations where we can get groups of people up. And so if you're interested in having any sort of a Kerr conversation and start having more dialogue about these types of topics, please reach out to us, let us know. Our email is kerr@kerr.org, and we would love to hear from you, and we would love to continue this dialogue and know how we can better support you.